Second Samuel chapter 3. And we noted that the first verse actually seemed more connected to chapter 2. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long drawn out, but David kept growing stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker. That seems to be really the end of chapter 2, which of course provides the backdrop for chapter 3. So there's two very important things that we need to remember from chapter 2 before we go into chapter 3. One was what I just read, okay, that the war kept going. Let me just reference something else that's part of that. If you recall, in chapter 2, we have this clash, bloody war encounter between the side of David and the side of Saul, and many people are killed. And at the very end, we have Abner calling, and this is chapter 2, verse 26. Abner calls to Joab and he says, "Must the sword devour forever? You know how bitterly it's going on. How long will you delay ordering your troops to stop the pursuit of their kinsmen?" And of course, we said there's a bit of irony here because it's Abner, after all, who started this whole thing at the pool. Let our young ones, play it out, which meant really fight it out with a very bloody consequence. So we have that going on, and they kind of separate after that. But it's not like the war is over, because we learn in the beginning of chapter 3, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long drawn out, but David kept growing stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker. So we have this idea of maybe these outward clashes may have slowed down, but there's still conflict going on. And what we're seeing is a progress of David gaining the upper hand and Saul getting weaker. So that is very important to remember as we start chapter 3. And the other thing to remember is that it's Abner who kills Asael. As they're splitting up, okay, and they're all kind of going to go home, we have Asael who goes after, runs after Abner, wanting to kill him. Abner warns him, "You don't really want to try to kill me." And in the end, he continues, and Abner kills Asael. So these are two background pieces of information that we need to keep in mind. Okay, verse 2. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second was Kilab by Abigail, wife of Nabal the Carmelite. Third was Absalom, son of Ma'achah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. The fourth was Adoniah, son of Chagit. The fifth was Shphatiah, son of Avital. And the sixth was Yitraam by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. So first of all, there's a whole list of people, a few interesting points. Some of these children we're going to meet later. The firstborn, Amnon, we're going to meet him later. Not such a savory fellow, but we'll save that to when we meet him. The second, Kilab. Never heard of this guy. Born to Abigail. Okay, so we don't know anything about him. He's the second born, so you would say, maybe he should be in line for the king, but we never see him as part of those who end up going for the king. And the question also is, who is this guy? Because he doesn't seem to be mentioned any other time. In Chronicles 1, where you have a whole list of sons and, all these things, the who's who of David's family. So in Chronicles 1, chapter 3, verse 1, these are the sons, this is a parallel verse to what we just read. These are the sons of David who were born to him in Hebron. The firstborn, Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelite. The second, Daniel by Abigail the Carmelite. So here he's called Daniel, and the other place he's called Kilab. And the question is, what all is this about? So some people say that Daniel was his real name, and Kilab, which is a real weird name, I have to tell you, it's not a normal name, Kilab, or Kalab, or Kalav, okay? These it could be, it was like a nickname or some kind of description of him more than his official name. So I have to say, though, when I read this, and it's Kilav is the way you would say it in Hebrew, Kilav, okay? Kilav, 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 Kilav. Kalev. Reminds us of Caleb. It also reminds us of something else. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 3. Right, here we go, verse 3. And this, we are in the middle of the story of David and Abigail and Nabal. Now, one of the things that's very interesting, what the verse we just read, is that when it talks about Abigail, it mentions her as being the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. Now, she was the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, who has since died, and then she married David. It's very interesting that here, in the context of her being one of the wives of David, it's mentioned that she's the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. Now, who is Nabal the Carmelite? And what we see here in verse 3, the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. The woman was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, okay, and here in English it says a Calebite from the house of Caleb, but actually in Hebrew it says Kalibi. Okay, so Kalibi could be he's from the house of Caleb. And that also reminds us of the word kalav. All those words, though, mean dog. Okay, now it could very well be that in verse 3, it's maybe that he's referred to the fact that he's from the family of Caleb somehow. But it could also be his family type, but it could also be that they're saying it specifically because they want to say the guy's a dog. And it's also very interesting in Hebrew, when we talk about Nabal, in Hebrew, his name is Naval, and Naval means a no good guy. No good. So it could be that what we're learning here in verse 3, Nabal is a no good dog. Okay, so go back to our verse, and we have a son of Abigail, wife of Nabal, whose name is Kilav. One of the suggestions, and again, we don't hear about him later. He's never mentioned to be in line for the king at all. So one of the suggestions is that she was actually pregnant when she married David. And so this is a son she had when she was married with David, but he's called Kilab because he's from that dog. He's from the Calebite, or however you want to define it. And then if that's the case, it makes sense because he would then not be in the line for inheriting David because his father was Nabal. But anyway, but what it also, if that's the case, it's clearly somebody that Abigail, that David takes as his own. So he's very, he doesn't say, "Ooh, I don't like your father." He becomes one of his sons, which is very nice. Anyway, these are just suggestions. You can accept them or reject them, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay, now let's move on. During the war, we're now in verse 6. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner supported the house of Saul. Okay, now we kind of know that already because we saw that Abner was the chief of staff of Saul, and he's the one who's leading the battle on behalf of the Benjamites and the rest of the people that are supporting the house of Saul, and Joab is David, okay? But we also learned before that if you go back to the previous chapter, to chapter 2, verse 8, but Abner, son of Ner, Saul's army commander, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought across to Mahanaim and made him king. Okay, so we already discussed then how Abner appointed Ishbosheth as a king, and Ishbosheth is clearly a puppet. Okay, he's not a leader in his own right. We never see him leading, saying anything of any, it's even presented that way, that it's Abner who made him king. It's not that the nation said, "Wow, we want to continue Saul's legacy and we love Ishbosheth, so please be our king." But it's Abner. So we already suspected then that Abner really is the power behind the throne, and he's using Ishbosheth because Ishbosheth is the heir to Saul, and so he has legitimacy to be a king, whereas Abner would not have legitimacy. So we see here in verse 6, we're kind of getting actually the way it's written in Hebrew actually is even more powerful, because in English, in my Bible at least, it says Abner supported the house of Saul, but what it actually says in Hebrew is Abner haya mitchazek. Abner became stronger in the house of Saul. So you get a sense that he's appointed this puppet king, and he is using that appointment to gain power for himself. He's become stronger. He has more influence than ever before in the house of Saul. And you'll notice it doesn't say the house of Ishbosheth, it's the house of Saul. So if anything gives legitimacy to Ishbosheth being a king, it is that he is part of the house of Saul. Okay, so that's another background. And now we get into a little story, okay? Verse 7. Saul had a concubine named Ritzpah, daughter of Ayah. Okay, and then in the Hebrew it says, and he said to Abner. We don't know who he is. Now, my English, it puts in already who he was, but that's cheating, okay? Because here it just says, and he said, and if you'll notice, there is no person before that other than Abner. We're talking about Abner. There's no other person involved here, but it's somebody says to Abner, why have you lain with my father's concubine? Abner was very upset by what Ishbosheth said. So it is only in the next verse that we learn that the person who said it, who asked that question, why have you lain with my father's concubine, is Ishbosheth. Now, I think it's very interesting here that the normal way to say it would be, now Saul had a concubine named Ritzpah, daughter of Ayah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you lain with my father's concubine? Okay, but he didn't put in Ishbosheth, it just said he. Now, I don't think that, someone was tired and didn't want to put in the word, and because actually the he becomes part of the conjugation of the verb. It's not a separate word. Whereas if you put in Ishbosheth, it's a separate word. I don't think somebody here is saying we're going to save a word. But it seems to me that there's a hint here in the text already that Ishbosheth is irrelevant. They leave him out. He's asking this question to Abner, but in the very sense that his name is left out, this is almost to say he's a nobody. He's a nobody, okay? He's king, but he's a nobody, okay? And this we'll see exactly played out in this little story. Why have you lain with my father's concubine? Abner was very upset by what Ishbosheth said, and he replied, am I a dog's head from Judah? Here I have been loyally serving the house of your father Saul and his kinsfolk and friends, and I have not betrayed you into the hands of David. Yet this day you reproach me over a woman? Okay, now, is this just a woman? Now, let us remember something. You may not remember this because we haven't learned it yet, but if you have learned the book of Samuel, if you have learned 2 Samuel before, you may remember that after David is king for some time, he is confronted by a terrible, terrible rebellion. His son Absalom rebels against David. And the rebellion is extremely serious to the extent that he conquers Jerusalem, and David is forced to leave Jerusalem with a small little party of loyalists. And he's going down to the Jordan Valley and escaping to a place where he can find refuge as Absalom is coming and taking over the city. And what is one of the first things that Absalom does when he sits on the throne of David? He lies with David's concubines. When you lie with the concubines of the king, what you are doing, and this is not just because he needed sex with these women, this is a symbolic gesture. And what it means is that I am now king. Since these and concubines, don't forget, are not wives. They're a much lesser status. They're somewhere between a servant and a wife, okay, a lesser status. So you could say that a concubine, again, we're talking about ancient times when people had different visions of women and roles and all that kind of stuff. So I don't like to bring judgment here on these people. Different times, different things were acceptable. But a concubine is closer to being a status symbol. I wouldn't like to say possession, but it still is a status symbol of a king when he has concubines. So basically what happens when somebody usurps the throne, one of the best ways that he can communicate to the public, yes, I am the new king, is that he will sleep with the concubines of the previous king. And so what Ishbosheth has seen and what he understands is that this is not just Abner is just not looking for these extra women, but he's trying to create an impression among the people that the real king is Abner. That's why he is sleeping with these concubines. And Ishbosheth figures that out. And so he questions it. And Abner's answer is complete derision. Oh, what do you know? You're arguing with me over a woman? Ishbosheth knows, he understands. Abner knows and understands, but Abner pretends that Ishbosheth is an idiot. He treats him like that, okay? And then he continues, Abner, may God do thus and more to Abner, if I do not do for David as the Lord swore to him, to transfer the kingship from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. So he goes further and he says, you know what? Here I am. I've been loyal all this time to Saul. Forget it. You don't appreciate me. It's only because of me that you're king, Mr. Ishbosheth. You don't appreciate me. That's it. I am now going to hand over the rest of the kingdom to David. Okay. Now, if you recall, last chapter, this is why we went back and read that verse again, Abner is presented as being this noble fellow who says to Yoav, you know, enough's enough. What are we going to carry the sword, must the sword devour forever? Such a beautiful expression, and he's like suing for peace, and he takes the first initiative. But even then, we question it. If you recall, whoa, he's the guy that started this thing at the pool and everything. And we questioned last week, how do we read Abner? Is Abner a good guy, a gentleman, an honorable man, or is there something else going on? And I think that what we're seeing here, both in the fact that he slept with these concubines, the way he treats Ishbosheth, is that he doesn't care about, he's not loyal to the house of Saul. He's loyal to Abner. And he's going to go and do whatever will bring Abner more power, which is why in verse 10, it's so easy for him to say, that's it, I'm joining up with David. He's probably figured out that, he has no future here. And there's only so much he can do because he's stuck with Ishbosheth as a king, and that's not going to create any followers, even though he has slept with the concubines. It's really hasn't done anything. It hasn't created him as king. And he probably figures, you know what, he's going to be more valuable being a chief of staff for David, or possibly sharing the power with Yoav. It very possibly already has his mind he's going to replace Yoav. He's a very, he killed Asael. Asael is described as very quick, very sure-footed. And Abner is somebody who says, with all due respect, I can kill you in a second. And he does. So we've already seen Abner as a very competent, he keeps his cool, very competent. And so he probably sees himself, you know what, I'm better than Yoav. And you know what, I'm going to throw in my lot with David. So you're seeing here something that's a lot more opportunistic that we have seen before. And what's the final word of Ishbosheth? Verse 11, he could say nothing more in reply to Abner because he was afraid of him. That's such a telling, that this is what we suspected. We suspected all along. He's not really a king. He's a puppet. He's a puppet. Nothing expresses that more than this ending. A king afraid of his chief of staff. It's supposed to be the opposite. It's the king who gives the orders to the chief of staff. But of course, Abner, he has taken over, and Ishbosheth has nothing to say. Okay, so now Abner moves forward on his plan. Abner immediately sent messengers to David saying, to whom shall the land belong? And to say further, make a pact with me and I will help you and bring all Israel over to your side. Very nice, very attractive. And he replied, which is David, good, I will make a pact with you, but I make one demand upon you. Do not appear before me unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come before me. Now, you may recall that after David escaped, Michal was his wife, his one and only wife initially. Saul had given his daughter Michal to David as a wife. And it was Michal who actually helped David escape. And we hear over and over, there were two people that we learn loved David. One was Jonathan and one was Michal. She loved David. And again, like Jonathan, we wondered, did David love her as much as she loved him? That was a big question, but she was desperately in love with David, and she helped him escape, and she created the ruse that as if he was in the bed, which gave David the opportunity to gain ground from Saul, and then he's gone, and her father is chasing him, and she's caught between a rock and a hard place. She's a woman, there isn't much she can do. She's caught in the palace. She doesn't want to leave her father, and at the same time, her father's trying to kill her husband, and we don't hear about her at that point, except at one point there's a little note, one verse that says, well, and Saul gave Michal to Palti, son of Laish. She's married to somebody else. Okay? We don't know anything about it. We don't know how she feels about it. We don't know anything. So here, David, though, hasn't forgotten. And he has these other wives. We learned at the beginning of this, he has a few wives. He's got a bunch of kids. But he says to Abner, if you really want to make peace with me, there's something you have to do to make this right. And that is you have to return my wife to me. Now, what does this mean? Is it just because she was my wife and I had her first and Saul took her away from me? By his wife being the daughter of Saul, basically what's happening is Abner is saying, let's make peace. And David is saying, there's no better way to make peace than to bring me back my original wife, which means my wife is Saul's daughter. And that's the best way we can bring our kingdoms together. And so that's what he says to Abner. But he doesn't stick with that. Verse 14, David also sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, to say, give me my wife Michal, for whom I paid the bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins. So he's not only saying this to Abner as a response to his, let's make a pact. He's going to write to Ishbosheth because he indeed is the heir to Saul. He's the son. He is Michal's brother. And so there is a family issue here, not just a political issue. But he also brings up justification. I paid for her, dowry, whatever. That was that whole deal. And so Ishbosheth sent and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. So here we have, before Ishbosheth is afraid of Abner, here Ishbosheth actually does something. And so he's not afraid of Michal. He just forces Michal to leave her husband. And it says here, verse 16, it's a heartbreaking verse. Her husband walked with her as far as Bahurim, weeping as he followed her. Then Abner ordered him to turn back, and he went back. So even though it's Ishbosheth who said, yeah, I'm gonna, he sent for her, Abner's there too, because at the end of the day, it's Abner who orders him back. So we have here, on the one hand, David gets his wife Michal back, and we're gonna talk about Michal in detail later on when we get to a story that's much more telling about where Michal is in all this picture. But we already see here, what a heartbreak. Michal probably, David went and she wants to stay with her father, and he never looked back. He never sent for her. She says, well, he's gone. And she marries this guy, and they have a good marriage, and they clearly love each other, and he clearly loves her, and he's heartbroken. But at the order of the king, his wife is taken and returned to David. I've always felt bad for Paltiel, I have to tell you. Such a tragic thing. All right, but let's go back to the politics. Abner had conferred with the elders of Israel, saying, you have wanted David to be king over you all along. Now, who are the elders of Israel? This is all those tribes, if you recall, when he made Ishbosheth king, and then he secured his kingdom over all the tribes of northern Israel, with the exception of Judah. David is only king over Judah. So all the rest of Israel has always been with Saul. So Abner now he does this deal. He's on his way to sign a treaty or whatever, or join up with David, but he wants to prepare the nation. He wants to bring the nation with him. Otherwise, his little treaty is not worth very much. And so he's reminding them, you have wanted David to be king over you all along. And this, in a way, is reminding us of the position of David before Saul started running after him. After he kills Goliath, then he becomes David's main, general. And we have that verse about when David would come back from the battle, all the women would come out and dance and praise David. And so here Abner's kind of recalling that. Remember those days when you loved him and you thought he was like even better than Saul? Now act, for the Lord has said concerning David. All of a sudden, Abner now is remembering that David has been anointed by God. If he was so interested in obeying God, he would have remembered this as soon as Saul was killed, but he conveniently remembers it now. I will deliver my people Israel from the hands of the Philistines and all its other enemies to my servant David. Abner also talked with the Benjaminites. Now that's the hard nut to crack. You remember, those were the main people that were with him in the battle in Gibeon, which is, of course, Benjamin, the tribe of Saul. Then Abner went and informed David in Hebron of all the wishes of Israel and of all the house of Benjamin. So he here has gathered everybody. So when he appears before David, he says, I'm not just speaking for myself. I bring you the rest of Israel. When Abner came to David in Hebron, accompanied by 20 men, David made a feast for Abner and the men with him. Abner said to David, now I will go and rally all Israel to your majesty. They will make a pact with you, and you can reign over all that your heart desires. And David dismissed Abner, who went away unharmed. So David here is, and now I don't like that. It's not he didn't go away unharmed. He went away in peace. That's the word at the end. B'shalom. David dismissed him. He says, okay, you can go. You're free to go. And he went in peace, which means that Abner leaves David under the understanding that he and David have just now agreed that he is bringing to David all of Israel so that David can rule over all of Israel, and Abner will be a loyal servant of David. Okay. And in the very next verse, everything switches and we have a twist in the plot. But we're going to have to wait until next week to continue the story and see what happens next. So we will take up again the story with verse 22. That's it. Any comments? Any questions?
I found it really interesting because I've often wondered about the tension in these relationships. Was Abner a good guy? You know, there's so many conflicts going on here. So it's really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I think, you know what, one of the things is we have a tendency, I'm like this, but I'm sure most people are. You have a tendency to want to categorize a person and say, is he of the good guys or is he of the bad guys? And that doesn't mean that the good guys are perfect and the bad guys are evil. But, you know, you like to feel like overall, this is a good guy and overall, this is a bad guy. And Abner remains a puzzlement because I think there's definitely things about him that are very positive. There are definitely things about him that are very negative. And he's probably just a human being, but he's not a hero. I don't see him as a hero. I see him as a problematic character. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
He seems to be cunning, actually, doesn't he? He's sort of playing the game, as it were. This seems to be cunning to me.
Right. There's a cunning to him. But then on the other hand, I remember he is the first one who says, you know, let's stop fighting. And when Asael runs after him, he desperately wants to avoid killing him. He said, you know, just go to the right. I won't tell anybody that you met me and that you couldn't kill me and just go. He doesn't want to kill him. And it's only when it becomes clear that Asael is going to kill him, he has to kill him first so he doesn't get killed. And there's something noble about that. And that's real. On the other hand, he's clearly opportunistic, clearly wants power. So, you know, it's kind of complicated. Anyway, okay. Great to see you all. And we will see each other again, please God, next week. Same time. Oh, next week we're changing our clocks tomorrow night. Okay. So next week we're going to go back to in the United States, we will have the same time as we used to have.
11 o'clock.
Do you also change your clocks in the UK this weekend?
Yeah,
Yes.
do.
Yeah, okay, so we in the UK always tend to be around the same time. So starting next week, we'll go back to the times we always had.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay,
you.
see you
Thank
next
you,
week.
Thanks a
Sondra.
lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.